Okay, I think it's time for us to get started. I can see a lot of people have joined. We wanted to welcome you to the orientation for the hackathon. It's really exciting to get this started, and we're looking forward to getting into it. So to begin with, Naoya from Whole Brain Architecture Initiative is going to give us a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll go through some of the details about the hackathon.
Okay, thank you for participating in this orientation for the 5th Whole Brain Architecture Hackathon. I'm Naoya Arakawa from the Whole Brain Architecture Initiative, and start the introduction of the orientation. The introduction covers the background of the hackathon and the gist of the competition. First, we move to the background. The hackathon is prepared and organized by the Whole Brain Architecture Initiative and Serenote. Serenote is an independent research group interested in interaction of brain regions for intelligent behavior and decision making. And Serenote will be introduced by Gideon later in more details. The Whole Brain Architecture Initiative is an NPO which promotes the open development of the whole brain architecture, or the whole brain architecture approach. Which is an approach to create a human-like artificial general intelligence, AGI, by learning from the architecture of the entire brain. Here, AGI means a human-like AI or human-level AI, as human beings are supposed to have certain general intelligence that can solve a wide variety of newly encountered problems. So the WBA approach, in a nutshell, is an approach to mimic or reverse engineer the human brain, which is supposed to have general intelligence. Another point here is that the approach mimics the architecture of the entire brain, not only small parts. So it is called the whole brain architecture approach. To promote the WBA approach, WBAI has held four WBA hackathons since 2015. Biological plausibility or similarity to the brain required has increased from a hackathon to another, and provided reference architecture has got more complicated over years. Okay, now we move to the gist of the 5th WBA hackathon. It is to implement working memory and ask participants to make agents to solve match to sample tasks, which I will explain later in more details. And a sample brain-inspired cognitive architecture is provided. And biological plausibility will be evaluated. Here, by working memory, we mean short-term memory used in performing tasks. So it is used in any task that requires remembering recent past. So we use it all the time. It is a building block of intelligence. However, it has not really being addressed in artificial neural network-oriented AI research. So it is a challenge to deal with in a WBA hackathon. So now I explain the competition a little bit. It started on May 1st this year, and it will end at the end of August. And it is on the CodaLab AI competition platform. And we ask you to make your code public on GitHub, and we will examine the code. And the evaluation will be held in September, and maximum 100,000 Japanese yen will be given to an excellent team or excellent teams. Okay, finally, evaluation. Your submission will be evaluated with first task performances, and secondly, biological plausibility of your code. So we ask you to submit written justification for biological plausibility. That means how your code is similar to actual brain. And the code will be inspected against the justification. Okay, the rest of the session will go like this. I will explain tasks in details after this, and Gideon will explain neuroscientific issues, and Gideon and Dave will explain architecture details and code, and Abdel will explain the CodaLab competition in more details. And after the intermission, we will have a hands-on session. It means you move your hands to see how the provided environment and code work. Okay, this is the introduction part. If you have any questions, short questions.
Thanks, Naya. So I'll move on to the description of the neuroscientific basis of working memory.
Before that, I explained the task.
Okay, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I share the screen again. Okay, I start the explanation of tasks. A task we use to evaluate working memory in the hackathon is called delayed match to sample task. Here I will show you the task in motion. In the task, first, a sample figure is shown. Then the sample disappears, and the two figures are shown. They are called target. And the agent is to select the same figure as the sample. So this is the sample. These are targets. So the agent has to remember the sample, target. So it requires working memory. And here, the sample and the target may not be exactly the same. In the example, the shape is the same, but the color, orientation, and size are not. In another type of task, well, they are supposed to be the same because they have the same color. So sometimes the shape is used to compare the figures, and sometimes the color is used to compare figures. And yet another type of task is called bar position task. It is to remember where the bar in the sample was. So the bar is at the bottom, left, top, and right. And to show the agent which game to play or which features to attend, it has a so-called exemplar or tutoring session before actual gameplay. So that the agent can select which feature to attend, the shape, the color, or the bar position. So the actual session is like this. So the environment selects the game type, and it shows a tutoring session where the agent doesn't have to do anything but just watch to see which game will be following. And after that, the agent plays the game. And I will show you actual sessions in a movie later. Well, there is another type of game called non-delayed match to sample tasks. They are basically the same as their delayed versions, but without delay. So they are easier than delayed ones, but it is not as easy as it seems. Because we implemented central peripheral vision and active vision into the visual system to be used. We humans cannot look at separated objects at the same time in detail because only the center of the visual field or fovea has high resolution. So we have to move the eye to look at objects to see in details. So it is called active vision. In non-delayed match-to-sample tasks, the agent has to move the eye to compare the target with the sample because of the central peripheral vision. So it has to remember two objects to compare. So even in non-delayed match-to-sample tasks, working memory is required. This is a picture of non-delayed match-to-sample with peripheral vision. So it sees the entire screen vaguely. And this is the central vision. It is actually this part. So here is the scoring details. There are several subtasks or games in the competition, like non-delayed ones and delayed ones. And non-delayed ones have like the shape game, color game, and bar position game. And shape tasks are a little bit difficult, so it has more points. And delayed games are more difficult than non-delayed ones, so it has more points. Finally, I will show you a demonstration or movie of the delayed match-to-sample task. This is the tutoring session. So it has a blue bars on top. So now it moves to the actual gameplay. So correct, after the correct answer, it shows a yellow bar. And it flashes to indicate which choice was taken. Left, left. This is another tutoring session with color game. So light blue, green, green, light blue, light blue. Red bar appears when it fails. The agent has to answer in a certain amount of time. This is a shape game tutorial, tutoring session. This shape, the same shape. This one. Okay, this is the end of the demonstration. So if you have any question. Okay, Gideon, please.
Okay, thanks, Naya. Yeah, just to reiterate, if this is meant to be an informal session, and there's not a lot of people, so if you have any questions, just don't be shy to switch on your mic and jump in. And also with your cameras, it's always nice to see people's faces, so don't be shy. So I'm going to talk about the neuroscientific basis of working memory. I think it's worth, firstly, can you see the screen? Just confirm. Is it being shared?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay.
I can see this.
I can see a screen, Gideon.
Okay, good. It says it's paused, which is, I've never seen that message before. Now, can you see it yet?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So you've already introduced and defined working memory, but I just thought it'd be worth sharing this definition by Badley. He was one of the first people to formally define it, and it's a very concise and useful definition. So I'll just read it out. Working memory is a short-term repository for task-relevant information that is critical for the successful completion of complex tasks. That's a useful one to keep in mind. And a common way to study working memory is using primates and giving them the DM2S task that Naya has described. In this really landmark study that was done in '98, there was a different version of the delayed match to sample task. In this version of it, the monkey looks in the center of the screen and is shown a sample. Then there's that delay period, after which a matching image is shown. And it needs to match both the object as well as the location of the object. You can see the top, an example of a matching object. This one is a different object in the same position, and the one below it is the same object in a different position. So it has to keep track of both those factors.
Gideon, I think, at least for me, I'm just seeing that working memory, what is it, screen?
Oh,
yeah,
really?
same.
Okay. All right, I'll just stop the sharing and reshare. Is that better?
No.
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, this is the screen I was looking at when I was describing that. I was showing these images on the right. You can see the example where there's the matching object. It's in the right, it's the right object and it's in the right location. The one in the middle is the wrong object in the right location, or at the bottom, the right object in the wrong location. And so if it matches, it's the preferred object. And what they found in single neuron electrophysiological recordings, have a look at the graph on the left, you can see that when there's a preferred object, the neural activity is increased and it stays increased over the delay period, that second part, whereas a non-preferred object activity is much lower, significantly lower, and that also is maintained over the delay period. And what's really interesting is that there are neurons in the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex in this case, that are active when it's the matching object, and other neurons that are active for the matching location, and some that are active for both. So what we learned from this is that there's persistent activity in the frontal cortex to support working memory. But the frontal cortex doesn't act alone. It obviously receives information from all over the brain. So we're just zooming out here to show other brain regions, in particular cortical regions, and how they fit in. So the persistent neural activity that I described in that experiment was in the prefrontal cortex, which is in the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is usually associated with higher level thought and conscious reasoning. It's at the front of the brain. And anything, so if you can think of the brain as a hierarchy, this is the top of the hierarchy. Anything below that is usually referred to as posterior cortex. And it's closer to sensing and motor action. It's closer to the world. It consists of the parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe, which is responsible for vision. And one of the important features of information processing in the brain is a division between the what and where pathways. The dorsal pathway that goes over the top of the brain towards the frontal lobe is the where pathway, and the ventral stream is the what pathway. It encodes the position, whereas where is encoding the location. And these two streams of information converge in the frontal lobes, and they also are bound together at the point of the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a really important structure for memory and learning. You can think of it it's like a simplification, but you can think of it as a short-term memory, and it replays those memories to the brain to consolidate memory as well as for cognition and to complete tasks. There's also really important interaction with deeper brain regions, which is shown here in a schematic diagram on the left and mapping to like the anatomical structure on the right to give you context of where it exists. Now, this structure, this diagram, there's a lot going on. So let's start starting with the prefrontal cortex here in the middle. So as we discussed, prefrontal cortex is kind of the driver of working memory. That's where the persistent activation is located. And it's actually controlled by the basal ganglia, which is a deep brain structure. That occurs via the thalamus, and it has a gating effect, which I'll go into in a moment. One of the interesting features of this is that the gating it acts with context, which is provided by the prefrontal cortex. So there's this kind of recurrent relationship between the two. And you recall I mentioned posterior cortex, the parts of the brain that are closer to the world. That acts like a mapping between sensory input and motor output. Another important region, or collection of regions actually, that are shown here as the critic, provide dopamine. That's DA stands for dopamine, and that's a reward signal in the brain. That's used to train the basal ganglia to do the gating of the PFC for working memory and for executive tasks. So together, the collection of brain regions that provide dopamine and the basal ganglia comprise an actor-critic architecture of reinforcement learning, if you're familiar with that. And yeah, I think that, any questions about what I've discussed so far? Okay, I'll move on. So we talked about, I mentioned gating, didn't go into a lot of detail. So this next slide is a simple mechanistic perspective of it that helps kind of illustrate how it works. So when a gate is open, the memory, the sensory inputs can fill the memory. When the gate is closed, that prevents the memory from being replaced. So it's actively maintained. The maintenance itself is implemented through a number of mechanisms, neural mechanisms, broadly through intrinsic membrane properties, but also through recurrent activity between neurons and also between the neurons in the cortex and the thalamus. We won't go into detail about that in this presentation, but you can find a lot of good information about it in particularly in a book by, have a look at the citation at the bottom left, Computational Cognitive Neuroscience by O'Reilly and Frank is a really useful resource for all of this. And the way that I'm describing it, if it's a computational model that they describe called PBWM. So now zooming out and putting it all together, this is a reference architecture for the whole brain, for the regions that are important for the working memory task. Again, there's a lot going on. So we'll start by just looking at this PFC in the center. And I described how there's a loop between the PFC and basal ganglia, and it occurs via the thalamus. So that's shown here, PFC, BG, thalamus. It's a cortical what's it called? Thalamocortical loop. Now, an interesting feature of the architecture is that in the frontal lobes, there are multiple loops like this that all operate in parallel. They also have a lot of interconnectivity because they provide context to each other. But this is a feature of the neuroanatomy, that there's parallel loops that occur in this way. We've included in this architecture the FEF, which is the frontal eye field, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is known to be important for this task in particular, premotor and motor cortex to act on the world. So the frontal eye field controls the gaze via an area of brain called the superior colliculus, and it's likely that it provides a reference position, and the superior colliculus then controls the tracking of the eye to that position using feedback from retina and visual cortex. And LIP is really important for encoding. It's important in that pathway that encodes the position of things and in the visual field. And you can see there from the visual cortex, we've got the what and the where pathways binding together and going into the MTL. MTL is medial temporal lobe. That's where the hippocampus is located. So that terminology is kind of used interchangeably with hippocampus. And then that is bilaterally connected with prefrontal cortex. When I say bilateral is the wrong terminology, I mean it goes in both directions. So we'll pause there and again ask if there are any questions. No? Okay, so moving on from that reference architecture, now this is a diagram of the, it's more of a class diagram of the code that we've provided as a starting point for the participants. The color-coded shapes show you the corresponding components in the architecture with the reference biological architecture. Where to start? Well, let's start with the environment. So the environment is shown here, or maybe I'll start by talking about reinforcement. In reinforcement learning paradigm, when you're programming, you need to make a distinction between the agent and the world. And so everything is either in the agent that's trained with reinforcement learning, or it's in the world. The agent code is shown in purple here on the right, and the world is this big box with gray background on the left. Because the agent, in this case, is the basal ganglia, and it acts on the prefrontal cortex has to be part of the world. So what we've got here is kind of a world within a world. We've got the world from a reinforcement perspective, which includes a lot of brain regions, but it also includes the game, which is shown in the bottom left dotted line here. And that's another world, which is, there's a reference to it in the agent environment. Okay, so the basal ganglia has this connection to the prefrontal cortex, which then acts on the game via the superior colliculus. The retina and the visual cortex are divided into two because of the active vision. Because we've got a foveal visual field and a peripheral, we've divided that into two that act in parallel. And we've used difference of Gaussian filters, which, because it's known to mimic well the type of processing that occurs in the retina, at a high level, what it does is it accentuates intensity differences or transitions. Positional encoding, some of you might be familiar with that terminology from transformer networks. And a positional encoding is used to provide an embedding which is suitable for inputting into a neural network that represents the location of the gaze. I'll just jump ahead. That's what it looks like. Left axis is position. The x-axis is the depth. So the extent of the vector that's provided. You can refer to the transformer paper, and there's lots of blogs about why they chose to do it this way and how it works. But essentially it provides a useful embedding to represent position. And that comes together in this data structure up here, what, where, which is then fed into prefrontal cortex and to the medial temporal lobe, as I discussed earlier. I think that covers everything, but again, are there any questions? Okay.
I
Go ahead.
was going to ask about if you're differentiating the agent and environment this way, is it that the hackathon is going to ask us only to implement the agent which is described here, or are we going to implement parts in the agent and the environment both?
That's a really good question. So all of this is provided, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail about the code in a moment.
Yeah.
One more thing I should add before I answer that is that the blue boxes are just, there's no state, there's no weight training required. They're fixed functions, and the sparse autoencoders have been pre-trained with unsupervised learning. And but you're welcome to change anything in the brain itself. So anything in the agent environment. Obviously, you can't change the game, but you're encouraged to implement code in the prefrontal cortex, in the superior colliculus, and they've been provided as just empty stubs at the moment. So in order to achieve, like, in order to enable the agent to complete the game, you're going to need to implement something in those components.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
The agent itself, the basal ganglia, is simply a feed-forward network, but there are config files to set the hyperparameters of those networks, and you're free to modify that as well.
I think I have a similar kind of a question, which is maybe just rhetorical, but I'm wondering why you chose this division between the environment and the agent. Just thinking a typical reinforcement learning agent, the perceptual components would be part of the agent and part of the agent's training, but here you've moved all those perceptual components and states more or less into the environment and just had a piece of the brain, so to speak, outside of it. I'm just wondering if you could maybe speak to why you chose to divide it up that way, as opposed to some other way.
Yeah, well, it's simply because that the basal ganglia learns through reinforcement learning, through receiving reward for taking actions. And we've used a reinforcement learning framework, the Pygame framework. Sorry, not Pygame, OpenAI Gym. And it enforces that you separate between the reinforcement learning component, which is the agent, and everything else, which is the world.
Yeah, but maybe I could phrase it differently. So that would imply as if part of my reinforcement learning algorithm wished to train the perceptual components, it would have to be able to make the environment differentiable, which is sort of not really, that's why you would not really divide it like this. Typically the environment would be, say, the game itself, and say the position of the eye maybe would be something that you would see in the environment. But the rest of it, like the retina and the autoencoder and all of that, would be part of the agent, because that part would be differentiable networks that you would train for your loss function. But here you're wrapping that in the environment, so you have to make the whole environment differentiable, I think.
Yeah.
I'd have to think about that a little bit more, but that's kind of what prompts my question about why it's divided like this.
There's no philosophical reason not to put it in the, like, if you want the perceptual processing to also be trained via reinforcement learning, then you could move that into the agent if you wanted to.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. It was just that we didn't approach it in that way, but there's nothing to stop you from moving it. Another thing I wanted to mention here is that currently the prefrontal cortex acts on the world of the game. There's one action space for the game. And so it can act on the world only with one command, like one variable. And there's a set of values that variable can take. So for some values, it is a gaze position, and for other values, it's a movement, it's a choice of which side, left or right, in the game. And so it's certainly possible to work around that and to figure out how to implement it such that the gaze position, when the command is a gaze position, that it's processed by the superior colliculus, and when it's a choice, it goes direct. But that's left up to you to implement. We already talked about that in there. So just wanted to let everybody know, if you haven't already seen, there's a wiki and there's lots of useful information there about the code, about the development environment, about all the things we've discussed so far. So don't forget, that's a good resource to use. And now I will hand over to Dave to talk a little bit about the libraries that have been used and the inheritance hierarchy that will help you orient yourself when looking at the code.
Thanks, Gideon. So Dave here. Yeah, I'm just still thinking about that previous question, and I think this diagram may make it easier to sort of understand the decisions that have been made in terms of how the agent code is architected. So maybe I'll explain this, and then we could come back to that question about if you want to differentiate, to use the RL learning in order to train the perceptual system. So basically, this diagram is sort of attempting to show the packages and the architecture used in the code. And I believe there's a copy of this diagram and most of the other resources on the wiki that Gideon just mentioned. So in short, the sort of core pieces that we've used, the system is based on PyTorch and NumPy. For the reinforcement learning, we've built in RLlib, which is part of Ray. And for the game environment, we've developed it on Pygame. And then for the reinforcement learning, binding the reinforcement learning to Pygame, we've used OpenAI Gym. So those are sort of the foundation stones on which the challenge is built. There is some code. There's two parts to the code for the agent, and this is really, I think it's about, there's a difference between the sort of conceptual boundary of where the agent ends and the practical boundary of what parts of the agent are trained by reinforcement learning and what parts of the agent are trained in another way. And there's nothing stopping you having additional losses of any type you desire, or even using reinforcement learning to train the entire agent. But we wanted to provide a code base that was as complete and functional as possible without attempting to solve the actual task. And so as a result of that, we have a visual cortex that is pre-trained to be functional. And Gideon, are you going to talk about some of the tasks that the code has already been shown to complete? You might be muted, Gideon.
Sorry, I was having trouble finding the button to unmute myself. It kind of disappeared. Anyway, well, in the hands-on session, we'll do that.
In the hands-on session, okay. Yeah. So basically, we've sort of validated that the code that exists is able to perform a number of tasks. So Gids, I think you jumped back.
Also, just in terms of, just to add to what you're saying and go back to that question, it was a philosophical decision to make the training, the distinction this way because of we've based it on PBWM, the computational model of working memory, in the literature, which depicts it in this way, that the gradient, like the temporal difference learning, occurs in the basal ganglia specifically, and that those losses don't flow through to train the visual system. And now there is evidence that does occur to some extent, but for the main part, the visual system would already be trained. And so that's why we made those decisions.
And I think you're saying, I remember us having discussions that the neocortical part of the brain is learns slowly, as opposed to the learning for this task needs to be quite quick. So there's a kind of the parts that you need to train slowly using a large number of independent samples. That's going to be really difficult to apply that type of learning in this task. You may be able to do it with a type of meta learning or learning to learn, but it probably would be quite challenging. So having a smaller part of the brain that's trained on the RL task is probably going to be easier from a practical perspective. But just coming back to this diagram about the code, so the intent is that anything in blue is sort of essentially like a stub or like an empty box that is able to perform the tasks that we'll show later, but is not able to complete the delayed match to sample task. But you're very welcome to modify anything in the blue sections, right? So that includes the agent, which in this perspective is just the RL agent, and also the agent environment, which is the part of the agent that is bundled into the environment from the RL perspective. Obviously, from an overall perspective, that's still part of the agent, but from the perspective of the framing of the reinforcement learning problem, that part of the agent is the environment. And I realize that's a bit confusing, but that's how it is. Now, there's nothing stopping you moving all of that code into the agent. You're perfectly welcome to do that.
But you also need to have a biological plausibility argument for that, because that's one of the criteria. So as long as
I understand where you're coming from or why you chose to do it that way. I don't know, maybe it's a little bit semantic, and probably as the thing evolves, we could have some discussions in Slack maybe and stuff about that. So I think I understand why you chose it that way and what you're thinking. So I'll just ask a slightly different question. So if we went back, if you can go back to the diagram for a moment. Perfect. So in this one, am I required to keep all of the boxes the same that are in the environment, and I modify their contents if I wish to add additional boxes or delete some of them? Not that I would necessarily do it. I'm just trying to understand the bounds of what would be considered valid. Would I be able to do that?
I think
yes, you can certainly add boxes and remove boxes. Again, it will just depend on biological plausibility and part of the as one of the criteria. So if you've got good reasons for doing it, then by all means.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
This is meant to be a starting point to help. It's not meant to be too prescriptive and restrictive, although there are some constraints because of the way that we've set up the competition. So when you submit, it will go to you do it through CodaLab, which is like a Kaggle, and then it will be evaluated in the Docker container, and there are scripts to run it, and the scripts have certain expectations about the code base. So there are some constraints on what you can change, but it shouldn't be too restrictive. And that's a good segue for me to pass on this over to Abdel. So Abdel can't stay much longer, so we'll hand over to him. And Dave, if you've got more to say, we can go back to you afterwards.
That's okay. Let's maybe we'll see how people are feeling after having a look at the examples in the code, and then can sort of follow the direction of the questions.
Okay. So Abdel, would you tell us a little bit about CodaLab?
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'll also share my screen. Well, I'll just start with CodaLab first. Yeah, so like you said, CodaLab is similar to Kaggle. So, yeah. Let me see if I can share my screen first. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
I can.
Okay. Yeah, so basically it's pretty similar to Kaggle, where everyone can submit their code and it will be evaluated. And it's pretty straightforward. So I just want to go through first kind of how the evaluation process will work. So now you have mentioned like how the scoring is going to work. So it's going to be a total out of 300. And note that these scores are scaled depending on the difficulty of the subtask. So in your development, you're just going to see, you know, the reward is like a 0 or a 1 or a -1, but we then scale them based on the type of task you're in at the evaluation stage. And the way that will work is that it will import your submission. And so that's where what Gideon referenced before about the naming restrictions, that it would try to import an agent class with an agent name in a specific location. And it's also going to try to use the agent environment. So if in your case, David, for example, the agent environment is mostly empty, it still needs to exist so that the evaluation will run, but it doesn't, you know, you don't need to have a PFC inside the agent environment, but it just needs to exist so that the code will run successfully. So if you get a chance, please have a look at all these kind of restrictions before you submit, just to make sure that the submission goes through properly, because it does expect, because the way we've constructed it is that it will just try to import specific classes from your submission and try to run them. And in addition to your code, it's also, you have to provide a pre-trained like checkpoint of your model. And the way we do that is you can specify them in a configuration file with that specific name. So you can see in my example here is that I've got this checkpoint path, and this is where it will exist. And basically what you will do is you need to archive your entire code base alongside the checkpoint. I've provided, you can basically just zip the file like that, and it will zip archive the entire code base as well as all the checkpoints. And once you've done that, you can go to the competition, and the URL is also in the wiki here. If you go to the competition, you can go to the participate tab and then submit, and it should load something like that. And you should be able to just submit your archive. CodaLab has this like weird UI issue where it doesn't really show a progression for your upload. But you will notice that the button is like disabled and you can't do anything. So until that is not disabled, that means it's still attempting to upload. So please keep that in mind, because there's like no visual indicator that it's actually uploading. And once that's been uploaded, you can see you can immediately see your results here, and you can see also the leaderboard for all the participants in the results page. And the way the evaluation script will work is, as Nair mentioned, we have the delayed match to sample and the match to sample tasks And so we'll just go through each task and do 10 trials and get an average over the 10 trials for each task. And that will be the final score for a particular task. Yeah, I think that's it. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, just to clarify, when you say running a trial, so is that a trial? I remember the first speaker, they showed this progression where there was an example, so to speak. Some teacher was showing you, oh, this is what I'm doing, and then it was followed by an evaluation of your agent. Is a trial both of those components, or is a trial a trained agent doing the match to sample task on their own?
No, so that would be doing it on its own without the mentor. So the mentoring would be only in like the training stage. So this will simply only just run your code on the task. And I believe each trial is like 6 steps. Maybe Gideon can correct me if I'm wrong. And that will be like your episode where, you know, we have a total score for your episode, and then we'll repeat it 10 times to get an average over 10. So that will be, and then it gets scaled based on whichever type of task it was, which then you'll get the final score for that.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, I think
so
that's it. Yep. You go ahead.
Each time the trial is run, I would think it will be the trial will be followed by a training or tutoring session, so that the agent knows which task is it doing, if it's matching the shape or color or bar position. So I would think before each trial it has to go through a tutoring period, but I may be wrong.
Maybe Gideon can expand on that, but I believe that your agent is meant to be able to perform across the different modes. But maybe Gideon, can you expand on that?
It needs to know which mode it's going to perform. You're on mute, Gideon.
Yeah, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yes, it needs to be able to perform across different tasks, but as Pauline said, the tutoring phase is the cue for it to know which task it's performing.
So that forces it to learn very quickly. It depends on your definition of learning, but essentially it has to adapt to or remember the task that it's supposed to be performing in this game until the end of that game.
Another way to say it is,
it does do the tutoring. It's not just testing on the task, it's doing the tutoring beforehand. And that's meant to be, well, I guess technically you don't have to learn from that. You could just say, oh, this is my context. Now I know what the context is.
yeah.
But it is doing both of those.
It's not weight adaptation. It's not that sort of learning. But if it's being recognized in working memory, so in that sense, it's learning.
Right.
It's remembering the context that it sees before it's asked to do the task.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that does mean that every trial is before every trial. Yeah, before every trial, a tutoring phase occurs.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Abdel and Dave.